그럼 두 번째 특별 세션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 데이터 분석을 활용한 접근 방식이 비즈니스 전 영역에 확대되고 있는데요. HR도 예외는 아닙니다. 이번 세션에서는 넥스트 HR 데이터 애널리틱스에 묻다를 주제로 기업이 활용할 만한 HR 애널리틱스의 글로벌 동향과 시사점을 짚어보는 시간을 가져보겠습니다. 이번 세션은 이재진 영국 리즈대학교 연구교수께서 좌장과 발표를 맡아주셨고요. 키스 맥널티 맥킨지 컴퍼니 인력기술 및 분석 글로벌 리더님, 에릭 반 불펀 HR 혁신 아카데미 창립자님, 마틴 에드워즈 퀸즐랜드대학교 경영대학원 교수님이 발표와 토론에 참여해 주시겠습니다. 마틴 에드워즈 교수님께서는 이곳에서 저희와 함께 해 주실 예정이었습니다만 현지 기상 악화로 부득이하게 온라인으로 참석해 주셨습니다. 여러분의 양해를 부탁드립니다. 그럼 이재진 교수님과 연사 여러분을 무대로 모시겠습니다. 큰 박수로 환영해 주시기 바랍니다. 네, 지금부터는 이재진 교수님께서 좌장을 맡아 진행을 해 주시겠습니다. 교수님 부탁드리겠습니다.
안녕하세요. 두 번째 특별 세션의 좌장을 맡은 이재진이라고 합니다. 저는 현재 영국 리즈대학교에서 HR 애널리틱스 주제로 연구와 또 학생들을 가르치고 있고요. 리서치 펠로우로 있습니다. 이 세션의 주제는 앞서 말씀해 주셨다시피 넥스트 HR, 데이터 애널리틱스에 묻다입니다. 데이터 분석이 HR 분야에서 활용되는 게 다른 비즈니스 분야들에 비해서 좀 뒤처진다 이런 얘기들이 좀 있는데 그럼에도 불구하고 몇 년간 계속해서 축적되다 보니까 이런 선순환 사례를 만들어 보고 있습니다. 오늘 이런 관점에서 어떤 어드밴스드 애널리틱스들이 또 작동되고 있고 어떻게 우리가 역량이나 스킬을 또 디벨롭 업스킬 할 수 있고 또 에티컬 이슈, 요즘에 윤리적 이슈도 중요하죠. 그래서 그런 것들에 대해서 함께 생각해 보겠습니다. 진행 방식을 잠깐 설명드리면 연사분들의 개별 발표 이후에 전체 토론 및 질의응답이 이어지겠습니다. 패널 모두 외국인 연사분들이시고 여기 영어, 한국어 통역이 동시 제공되는 점을 감안해서 편의상 이 세션의 대부분은 영어로 진행하려고 합니다. 참고 부탁드립니다. In this session, we have three prominent guests. Keith McNulty, the global head, global leader of people technology and analytics at McKinsey & Company, and Eric van Wulfen, founder of Academy to Innovative HR, shortened for AIHR, and Martin Edwards, a professor and deputy head of the University of 퀸즐랜드 Business School. Martin was supposed to be here together with us in person, but she mentioned, unfortunately, due to severe weather condition yesterday, his flight was cancelled just before he was about to depart. As far as I know, Martin had been waiting at the airport for around six hours for better weather, but the weather got worse. Therefore, he joins us now via virtual call. Hi, Martin. How are you?
Hello. I'm good, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So I can't be there.
All right, good. Anyway, thank you all participants for joining this session. Today I'll be moderating this session as well as delivering my presentation with fantastic panelists. To ensure a smooth flow, I'll present first and then moderate the presentations by the other speakers. Let me move to and prepare my presentation. The first presentation that I'll deliver is about global HR analytics trends and several considerations we must keep in mind when adopting or introducing HR analytics in organizations. Before I start in earnest, I'd like to briefly talk about my career path. After completing my undergraduate studies in mathematics, I worked as a strategy consultant and HR practitioner for about a decade. Subsequently, I moved to the UK to pursue my master's in HRM and PhD in HR analytics, and now work in academia. Initially, I did not intend this career path, though it has gradually shaped itself towards HR analytics. From this presentation, you can expect the following. such as definition of HR analytics and its trends, and some changes in perception of HR analytics by HR practitioners in South Korea. And also mentions the background of global HR analytics leaders, some requirements of HR analytics team, and also advanced analytical methods such as network analysis. Lastly, but not least, collaboration, its importance of collaboration between academia and industry. Let's begin with this fundamental question. What is HR analytics? In my view, HR analytics is a socially constructed concept. Many assume that HR analytics is a compound word of HR and analytics. Or some believe that when we use data-driven approaches in the field of HR, that is HR analytics. These are all right, but however, my perspective is slightly different. Consider salt as an example. Salt tastes salty, right? As many know, salt is a combination of two chemical components, sodium and chloride. Interestingly, neither possesses a salty taste, but when combined, we can taste the salty flavor. Similarly, the integration of HR and analytics might yield some unknown taste, like salty flavor, in the process of combining HR and analytics. And I believe we can uncover these implicit properties through a sociological lens. Some of you might have heard this term people analytics before. In this field, people analytics and HR analytics are used interchangeably. And both terms imply a data-driven approach in the field of HR. When you look at the trend regarding the name of this discipline, they both appear with similar frequency, as you can see on the left side of the slide. As you can see from the right side, North and South America, most of Europe and Australia prefer to use people analytics, whereas the Middle East, Africa, India, Asia, including South Korea, use HR analytics more frequently. However, blue and red colors here representing these two terms are not very dark, but light. This means in most countries, there isn't a significant difference in the frequency of use between these two terms. Therefore, in this session, the other speakers and I will use these two terms interchangeably in consideration of presentation context. Here are some insights drawn from perceptions regarding HR analytics in South Korea. I collected data from Korean HR practitioners in both 2019 and 2023. The survey used a 5-point scale with responses of 4 or 5 being considered a positive answer. Even though the sample size isn't that large, I believe it still provides valuable insights into the general perception of HR practitioners. From the bar graph on the left side, we can see the awareness of HR analytics increased to nearly 90% in 2023. So 9 out of 10 HR practitioners now know that what HR analytics is very well, and also are able to explain this concept to their colleagues and stakeholders. Meanwhile, the preference for data-driven decision-making in organizations has remained relatively unchanged, hovering around 25% over the past 4 years. Further results show that both the level of perceived data quality and prevalence of HR analytics have roughly doubled compared to 4 years ago. The percentage of respondents who believe that data is trustworthy has risen from around 14% to 24%. Similarly, the percentage indicate that companies are effectively implementing HR analytics has also increased from approximately 7% to 14%. However, despite these increases, the overall perceived reliability of the data and the use of HR analytics within organizations remain at a relatively low level. Let's have a look one more aspect. What are the primary obstacles to successful HR analytics in South Korea? Regarding this question, there has been little change over the past 4 years. Overall, Korean HR practitioners indicate that data is not adequately managed or secured, and there is a significant lack of analytical capabilities and skills. Furthermore, the absence of project sponsors, especially from C-level leaders, including CHROs, is a major challenge. Let's turn to our attention to overseas for a moment. On the left, from your side, this person is Catherine Hogan, the current CHRO at Microsoft. And on the right side is Lina Nair, the former CHRO at Unilever. What do these two people have in common? Yes, they are both women. And they are regarded as global leaders in the field of people analytics, and also they both have a CHRO experience. But I want to emphasize here is that both have studied quantitative science discipline and come from mathematics-related backgrounds. But as you know that, they are not engineers or programmers. They are CHROs. I think the reason why these two companies, Microsoft and Unilever, have a wide range of successful case studies and experience in the field of HR analytics is probably related to their CHRO's academic background. In this regard, let's delve into more detail. What kind of background do global HR analytics leaders have before entering the people analytics field? I analyzed the LinkedIn profile of 279 leaders, including these three people, our panelists. What career experience did they have before entering the people analytics field? Most had background in HR or consulting worker experience, which makes sense for many of us. However, when considering educational background, it's a bit different. The top 5 majors were business management, HR, engineering, economics, and computer science with approximately 10% each. In other words, about half of the leaders in the field of HR analytics have academic backgrounds in these 5 disciplines. It's even more interesting to see how this has changed over the past a few years. Regarding career experience compared to 3 years ago, the percentage of leaders with a career background in the field of HR has decreased. On the other hand, those with career experience in HR analytics has increased. And the other categories have remained at a similar level. What about change of academic background? Overall, compared to 3 years ago, there is a noticeable increase in the proportion of leaders with academic backgrounds in HR, engineering, and computer science. Conversely, the percentage of leaders with background in business management and economics has decreased significantly. As you look back the early stages of HR analytics field, over time, leaders with expertise in HR and technology-related majors have become increasingly prominent. Some companies might already have an HR analytics team, or some others may have a consideration to establish an HR analytics team in the near future. For my doctoral research, I've studied organizations that have adopted or introduced HR analytics within their company. In terms of building an HR analytics team, I think we need at least 2 key experts, an HR professional and a data analyst. But the thing is I'd like to emphasize here is their requirements. The HR experts should have some experience in data analysis and also need to have a broad employee network within the company, as well as the understanding of company history. This is crucial because not only for defining business problems clearly, but also securing relevant data from other departments. Likewise, a data analyst should understand the business process and HR functions, in addition to having deep knowledge of HR tech solutions, statistics, and various advanced analytical methods. If we neglect these aspects, it will be really challenging to establish HR analytics function from scratch. I think one of our panelists today will talk more in depth about this, but using network analysis has a huge potential in the field of HR. Typical organizations have a hierarchical employee structure like this. However, with network analysis, we can visualize three-dimensionally employees' relationships. For example, in an organization, who the key person is, or to measure individuals' influence and relationships, etc. It's a bit tricky to share my own practical project thoroughly due to confidential reasons, but this is a sample diagram illustrating the network of 48 leaders at one anonymous company. Leader number 15, isolated to the far left bottom side, and without leader number 24, this person would likely be disconnected from the other leaders. And also we could visualize the relationship between 48 leaders based on different attributes such as department, position, gender, etc. These diverse perspectives allow us to understand the organization more deeply and thoroughly. If we conduct this analysis regularly, we might gain insights as to the organization's structure and policy change. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to emphasize the value of collaboration, especially between companies and academic institutions. Recently, 61 UK companies collaborated on research with several academic institutions such as Boston College, University College Dublin, and University of Cambridge. Their aim was to analyze the impact of adopting a 4-day work policy without a reduction in salary. The findings were very impressive. I recommend anyone who is interested in this research to explore further through provided reference. Additionally, on the right side is one of my current research projects. The University of Leeds, where I work, has been collaborating with National Highways for many years to scientifically study the relationship between diversity and employees' performance. I believe this is one of the most effective ways to approach and enhancing HR analytics in the long run for both in the industry and academia. This concludes my presentation. If you are interested in HR analytics learning resources, please feel free to scan this QR code, which is a collection of HR analytics learning materials in Korean. I welcome any questions you might have after all other speakers' presentation. And now I return to my other role, which is the moderator. Thank you. Right. Our next presenter is Keith McNulty, the global leader of people analytics and people technology and analytics at McKinsey & Company. He will be presenting on the topic of advanced application of people analytics. Please join me in welcoming Keith.
Thank you very much for your warm welcome today. As Jae-jin was mentioning earlier, I'm here to talk about advanced applications of people analytics. I think it's very interesting and motivating to see what some of the leading companies and leading groups are doing in this field. And so what I'll talk about today is really the question of how you become an advanced group in people analytics, what you need to get there, and then also give you some examples of the types of work that, that advanced groups are doing in this field. Just a little bit about me first. Just like Jae-jin, I started out in mathematics. And just like Kathleen Hogan and Lena Nair, I learned today, I started out in mathematics. I did a PhD in pure mathematics, and I focused in on topics which I now use regularly in my work today, such as graphs and network analysis. I then left academia and moved into management consulting, and very quickly I specialized in psychological and psychometric type of work in that field. And I spent about 10 years working in work that wasn't very quantitative, a lot of psychometric design and measurement design. One of the things that interested me a lot was how do you make fair and accurate measurement of people in the workplace? And about 7 years ago, I transitioned into leading a team of analytics professionals. And I felt that I had the perfect mix because I'd studied mathematics, I had a lot of quantitative capabilities, but also I'd spent 10 years studying psychometrics and organizations. So that mix came together quite nicely for me to lead a team which started out with about 10 people and is now over 70 people. So that gives you a sense of, in my organization in McKinsey, how important people analytics is as a discipline to that company. I do a lot of external engagement. I've written some textbooks to help people learn about some aspects of people analytics. And if you want to follow any of my work, you can just scan the QR code there, which will take you to my LinkedIn profile. I'd like to talk a little bit about maturity in people analytics. So what does it take to get to a stage where you are doing advanced people analytics? One of the first problems that organizations have is poor data. And an organization operating with poor data is often finding themselves sending data around in local files and spreadsheets. People are looking at data and they're not seeing the same data, or leaders are questioning why one report says one thing and another says another thing. These are all very common for organizations that are struggling with their data. The first step on the maturity staircase is to get to a point where your data is good. For your data to be good, you need to be operating a very effective transactional data system. A lot of companies now are implementing systems like SuccessFactors or Workday. All of these are very important ways to structure your data and try to make sure that you have consistent data to get consistent measurements around. But having good data is not enough. So step 3 of the staircase is to find a way of making that data available to decision makers at good times when they need it. And this requires technology for disseminating and analyzing your data. One of the biggest problems in this field is something I call data entrapment. So often by putting your data in vendor systems such as Workday or SuccessFactors, it can be challenging to then extract your data from those systems in order to analyze it. So good people analytics teams that are operating at step 3 of this staircase will have very good data engineering capabilities that will allow them to extract the data from the systems and organize it in a way to make analytics much easier and to send the data into reports or other types of dashboards or web applications that allow their leaders to get access to the information quickly and to make decisions rapidly. And this is one of the areas where I think most organizations still struggle with. Even though they have their data in these systems, they're not necessarily using it in an optimal way for their leaders to make good operational decisions around their data. Now, assuming that the organization has made good progress around steps 2 and step 3, they're ready to embark on step 4, which is to take on advanced analytics. And in this area, this is where data scientists and statisticians start to become important in your organization. This type of analysis is more strategic analysis. It looks at data longitudinally over a long period of time, or complex data, or different data structures, such as network data structures, which I'll talk about later. But this type of analysis definitely requires a level of advancement in the capabilities of the analytics professionals and requires people who can program in the latest data science languages. And it's important to reach this step that people who have those capabilities are embedded into the HR function. The very top end of the staircase is something that's actually quite rare, and it needs to be done very carefully in organizations. So to make reliable predictions using data has to be done only in situations where it's safe to make those predictions. And my team in particular operates at this level in what I call low stakes settings, where the predictions can be wrong, but when they are wrong, it's not particularly damaging to the answer or to the employee or to the situation, that the humans can deal with a wrong answer. But there are some areas where wrong predictions can be very damaging to an employee, for example, in areas of evaluation or recruiting or decisions such as that. And so predictive analytics at step 5 needs to be used with extreme care. But there are some organizations that are operating at this level, and I will give you a case example of a low stakes predictive analytics example at the end of this talk. So the first example I want to talk about is network analysis. This is something which my team spends a lot of time working on. The case study I'm going to talk about here is one regarding my company's United States offices. So in the year 2020, we were still operating with 5 regional United States offices in different parts of the United States. And our leaders asked us a question about whether this structure made sense. Do our employees still collaborate within regions, or is there another way that our employees collaborate, and should we maintain a regional structure or a different type of structure to give us maximum impact? So in order to solve this problem, we actually took over 1,000 employees and we connected them via details about their meetings in the company, so that people were more connected to each other the more meetings we knew they had together. We then used a community detection algorithm which managed to divide these 1,000 people up into 11 communities where people in each community were more likely to interact with each other. And then we analyzed these communities, and what we discovered was that these communities were more related to the industry that the people were serving and not the region that they were located in. And we used a diagram like the one you're looking at now to illustrate this. So as you use a force-directed algorithm, you see people with the same color start to form in pools together, which was a way of showing our leaders that this is the most accurate way of describing how people interact, which is according to the industry that they served. And as a result of this, we ended up actually getting rid of all our regional offices and moving to one United States office because of this work. Another area where we do a lot of work is in natural language processing or text analytics. So, for example, we send out a weekly survey to teams. And in this survey, people can respond with comments about how they're feeling or how their work is going. And of course, we receive many thousands of comments a week and hundreds of thousands of comments a year. And it's impossible for human beings to absorb all of this information. So we use a technique called topic modeling, and it uses statistical methods to break down what the comments are saying and group them into comments that are referring to the same topics. And this allows us to very quickly see what are the main things our employees are talking about, how are they talking about them, and how do those things change over time. This is an example of a topic modeling analysis we did at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So the lighter colors show topics that came up towards the beginning of the period. It's a 6-week period at the beginning of the pandemic. The lighter colors are at the beginning of the period, and the darker colors are towards the end of the period. The size of the bubbles indicates how frequently the topic was arising, and lines between topics mean that they're more likely to appear together. And what we see from this diagram, if we look at it carefully, is that at the beginning of the pandemic, the employee base was unsure about what was happening. They were glad to still have a job. They were glad to still be healthy. But they had a lot of uncertainty about how things were going to develop. And as we move towards the darker colors 6 weeks later, it's more clear that the consequences of the pandemic were becoming apparent to our employees. They were concerned about their work-life balance, how they were able to juggle lockdown at home with their childcare. They were also missing their colleagues at work because they hadn't seen them for a long time. So you can see how this sort of technique helps take large amounts of information and funnel it into understandable messages that can then be communicated to leadership to help them make decisions and understand better how their employees are feeling. Another technique I want to talk about is statistical cluster analysis. Cluster analysis is a very effective mathematical way of looking at populations and trying to understand, are there structures inside these populations? Can we characterize them into different groups? In this particular piece of work, which we did for a McKinsey client, the aim was to understand, for the people that were not being promoted, how do we describe those people? Do they fall into different types of groups or different characteristics? And you can see on the left-hand side here that we used a lot of quantitative measures to look at the different characteristics of the employees. And then we used cluster analysis to take these measures and form them into separate groups, such that the groups were falling in different parts of space according to the clusters. And an example of the 4 groups that came up in this analysis, the first group was women without sponsors. So these were mostly female. They were not having a good experience with their management, and they were feeling like they didn't really have someone to look up to in the organization to support their development. The second were more junior employees who were having difficulty gaining momentum. So these were low tenured employees whose performance was not particularly good. The third group were diverse and dissatisfied employees, so people who were in common diversity groups who were not having a very positive work experience. And the last group were satisfied high performers, so people who were performing very well and had very good indicators of performance, but appeared to be very satisfied and not particularly driven to move to the next level of the organization. So that gives you a sense of how mathematical techniques can be used to describe different groups, which makes the problem easier to communicate to leaders and easier to solve because they can start to characterize the types of populations, very much like a marketing effort, so that they can understand how best to address each of the issues. Now, I'll go back to network analysis. Network analysis is not just about people. It can also be about other things. One of the topics that many organizations are trying to understand right now is skills, because in the age of AI, there's a sense that some skills will be more needed in the future and some skills will be less. And we use graph analysis to understand skills. Here is an example of one way we do that. So there are a lot of skills in the world, and anybody looking at two skills don't necessarily know or understand what those skills are. And a recruiter, for example, might need to know if two skills are related to each other. So in this diagram, we have two very technical skills, one called Kedro and the other called Databricks. These are programming skills. And we understand that these skills are related to each other because we can connect them to them both appearing in job descriptions together and also both appearing on applicants' resumes or CVs together. So you can see that these two skills are being connected by both commonly appearing in job descriptions and commonly appearing in CVs, which helps us infer that these must be related skills. And when we deploy this type of technique in a graph database at scale, it allows us to do very intelligent searches on skills. So on the right-hand side, you can see the results of a search where we looked for skills related to search engine marketing. And the skills that were returned are all very related to the types of work that marketers do related to search engines. And this type of thing will help a recruiter who doesn't necessarily know the discipline understand whether an application is strongly related to a job or not in a very mathematical way. Lastly, I want to talk about predictive analytics. This is an example of a low-stakes setting where we use predictive analytics. So we take a lot of data related to survey data and digital exhaust data about people's work environment and workday, and we created an algorithm to alert us as to whether teams may be having poor experiences. And every 2 weeks, this algorithm operates, and if a team comes up with a high probability of having a poor experience at work, we send an automatic alert to their manager, asking their manager to contact them and talk to the team and understand whether there is an issue that needs to be solved. And this is an effective low-stakes use case because if the algorithm gets it wrong, it doesn't do any particular damage to the team. It just encourages the manager to be more proactive and reach out more effectively. So this is an example of a low-stakes setting for predictive analytics, which I think is something that is very, very useful. To wrap up my talk, I would just like to put up some QR codes of books and articles related to what I've just spoken about. I would encourage you to follow up on these if you're interested and do some more reading. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Keith. I'm very glad that Keith covers very deep dive about network analysis because there are some questions about network analysis from the floor. So Keith and I will cover these questions after all others presentation. Our last presenter is Martin Edwards, a professor and deputy head of the University of Queensland Business School. He will be presenting on the topic of ethical challenges to consider with analyzing employees' data. Please give you a warm welcome to Martin.
Hello. Yes, hi, thanks for the introduction. And thanks for some great talks there, all three of you. Some really, really interesting stuff that you're focusing on. Hi, I'm Martin Edwards, Professor in Management, School of Business, University of Queensland. I've been working in people analytics for a number of years. and have written on people analytics back in 2015, 2016. Yeah, so today I'm just going to talk a little bit about some ethical challenges, ethical issues that we might want to think about with people analytics. I'm going to focus on the input, the early stage of a people analytics project, the data collection stage, the analytic stage itself, where organizations are doing analytics projects and ethics associated with that, aspects to do with ethics and analytic outputs and what happens when an organization runs through a people analytics project in terms of the outputs. I'll briefly mention ethics associated with automated algorithms and AI, but I won't be talking about that for too long because it's a massive topic. But just the first thing I want to do is just highlight the issue that ethics is not a black and white topic. It's not the case that people can consider something as being ethical or not. When you make an ethical judgment associated with a HR practice or an organizational practice, you'll be potentially coming at it from a number of different lenses. So I'm not going to go through all the lenses, but just an example of different kind of lenses that an organization might be thinking about when considering ethics. For example, legal lenses, whether or not you're breaking the law when you're doing some HR analytic activities, but you can also take other lenses as well. Stakeholder theory, for example, considering different stakeholders that have been impacted or could be impacted by an analytics project. Sustainability perspectives, whether the analytics projects help an organization with its sustainability goals, corporate social responsibility, social justice perspectives, and deontic framework, whether the organization's thinking about the rights and obligations of and taking a moral obligation in terms of that it's doing the right thing when it carries out different HR analytics projects. There's also justice frameworks anyway. So the point is there's lots of different lenses that you might come up when you're thinking about whether or not something might be considered ethical or not. So just to focus on the input stage of an HR analytic project. So one of the key things, the first stage that an organization will be thinking about is the data collection stage, because this data collection will generally be on employee data. And so there are ethical challenges and issues that an organization might want to think about at that stage. How is the organization collecting that data? The organization might be wanting to go out and collect more data. There might be some monitoring of employee activities that the organization might need to be doing to collect data. So for example, with employee email data, network analysis, there's some monitoring activities going on there that an organization might want to think about privacy issues associated with that kind of activity. There's also a stakeholder perspective in terms of the input stage, the data collection stage, and obviously employees are a key stakeholder there. And so some data may be quite private to employees. So as an example, health data. And so there are issues there about who's the owner of that data, data governance issues, who's the real owner of that data, is it the employees or the organization? So some interesting stakeholder perspectives there. There's transparency issues, whether the organization is sharing with employees information about what it's doing with HR analytic projects, and is it reporting and sharing with employees that it's doing kind of different types of analytic projects and explaining why the organization is actually doing these projects. And so that there's a transparency issue there that an organization needs to think about. And then has the organization given employees meaningful consent in terms of whether or not they have asked employees whether they're willing to have their employee data shared for the purposes of an analytics project. So the point is that's the kind of input stage of an analytics project. A whole range of ethical issues can be raised at that input early stage. And then there's the actual processing, the analytic processing stage, where the organization is doing the analysis, that some ethical issues are potentially raised. So for example, whether or not certain people or data has been included in an analytics project or omitted from an analytics project. Is the data set that's being used full and complete? Are certain people potentially being included? There's issues around validity and reliability of a data set that an organization's doing or using for its analysis. And there's the adage that rubbish in leads to rubbish out, in terms of if the data is problematic in the first instance, and then a HR analytic team will spend a lot of time trying to make sure that their data is clean and valid. But the issue is, if there are problems with the data, then any recommendations that may come out of an HR analytics project may be problematic from a perspective of problematic data has been used in the first instance. There's issues associated with discrimination and fairness and equity of data that's as a source that's going into an analytics project. And we often see in the field of HR analytics stories around algorithmic and analytic projects potentially leading to some biased outcomes. And often the data that has led to those biased outcomes may have been problematic in the first instance. Just as an example, let's just say we're using an analytics project, or we're going through an analytics project to try to identify who might be a good or the best person to hire. The data source that's leading to that recommendation may be drawn from our organization's historic data. And let's just say in our organization, males have been more likely to be promoted because there may be some kind of bias in the organization, and have been more likely to get better, more positive ratings in performance evaluations. Then perhaps if we're using that data set, and there may be some bias in that data set, to try to get some recommendations in terms of who we might want to hire, then basically there's the issue that that data source is biased in the first instance. And so that's the key issue you want to think about. And then modeling with our analytics project, what is and isn't included in our models, and can our HR team be able to explain the key features of our model and how those key features, so for example, gender and the degree to which gender might be being an important feature of our model that might be predicting whether or not we should be hiring people. Can the organization explain how our models are working and be transparent and explain the key features of our model? So there's some real key ethical issues there associated with our analytic projects. And then there's the output stage of an HR analytic project, often where the organization has done some analysis and our analytic model is then making recommendations around what the organization should be focusing on in terms of who to hire, who to promote, and who to pay attention to, et cetera, et cetera. So that output stage. And one of the key things that the HR analytics team needs to be able to have is the capability to ensure that their interpretation of the analytic project is an accurate interpretation, and they're aware of the key limitations of analytic project, and whether or not, for example, our analytic models are able to give us information about, for example, causality. Ultimately, often with our HR analytics projects, these projects will often be steering the HR function into making some decision making associated with selective investment. So, for example, who to potentially hire, who to potentially promote, or steer some more investment in terms of training or whatever. So that selective decision making is really key as an output of an HR analytic project. And there are challenges associated with that from an ethical perspective for the organization to have the capability to make sure that the outputs of those selective investment decision making processes are fair and that they are non-discriminatory across the organization, and they're not having a discriminatory negative impact on certain groups of the workers. So the capability of our HR analytics team to be able to make that assessment is really key, and ultimately to be able to follow the idea that our analytic project is not necessarily doing any harm. So follow the principle of doing no harm with our HR analytic projects. And so that's key in terms of the output stage. Now, one thing, and we're all very aware of the growth of algorithms and AI, and our other presenters earlier have mentioned these issues. There's lots of ethics associated with the application of automated analytic processes and algorithms and AI, and there's a whole world of ethical issues associated with that. I don't have time to go through lots of those. I'm just going to throw a couple of key issues there. If our algorithms and our AI systems are making decisions or making recommendations in our HR function, our HR analytics team, then is the organization, the HR team, able to explain how those algorithms are working? There's big challenges there. Are those automated processes? Do they have enough human oversight by the HR analytics team to make sure that there aren't problematic biases associated with those algorithms? And the HR team is going to need to be able to, and I've already mentioned this, do an impact assessment in terms of the impact of particular analytic processes. And obviously, if we're going to introduce AI or automated analytic processes in our HR analytic team, then the challenges associated with automated decisions being made can raise challenges from an autonomy perspective, so that in terms of humans, decisions aren't being applied to them that in essence reduce their autonomous focus. One thing I would just want to end on here is there's lots of ethical challenges potentially associated with HR analytic activities. What can HR do to help overcome some of these problems? One of the key things is that HR analytics teams need monitoring in terms of the kind of activities they're doing, and there needs to be some accountability associated with the kind of projects they're involved in. The analytics teams need to have the capability to ensure that they do to interrogate their own models to make sure they're not biased, and actually question activities associated with the projects that they're involved in. And HR analytics team will need to enshrine ethical charters and HR analytics ethical codes of conduct in terms of the activities that they engage in, to make sure that ethics is a key issue and thing that the teams consider and reflect upon when they're engaged in HR analytic teams. And just throwing out the idea that transparency with employees and communication with employees in terms of what kind of data is being used for different HR analytic projects and what the data is being used for is really key in terms of informational fairness with employees from an ethical perspective. And organizations need to be giving employees regular updates in terms of what the organization is doing with their data, and potentially give the opportunity for employees to opt out in a meaningful way of having their data included in an analytics project if they are not comfortable with it. That raises some real challenges for an HR analytics team who might have to, they'll be balancing the challenges associated with ensuring that employees, the organization is being transparent with the employees about what they're using their data for, but and also giving the employees the opportunity to opt out of certain projects. But that raises some really interesting challenges in terms of that potentially creates a challenge for the organization in terms of it might lead to some missing data in a data set, and they'll have to manage that in their analytic processes. And so that raises some interesting challenges there from a from an ethical perspective with the HR analytic team. But I guess the key point and message that I'm getting across here is that a key capability that is required in an HR analytics team is a capability to be able to really interrogate and question and challenge and make sure that they're considering the ethical lens associated with what they're doing in terms of their HR analytic activities. And so I consider that to be a key capability that an HR analytic team needs to include in their activities. So I'll leave it for there, but thank you very much. There's lots I could have covered. Hopefully that gives you some ideas about some of the interesting challenges associated with ethics and HR analytics.
Great, thank you so much. I think it seems to overlook, sometimes many people overlook the importance of ethical issues, and I think it's not exaggeration to say that considering ethical issues is foundation of people ethics. Now we are going to have a Q&A session with the audience. A lot of questions came up during our presentation. As I mentioned, there are many questions about network analysis, and Keith and I will cover a series of questions. It might be easier. The first question is here. Can you see somewhere? Okay. This is question to me, actually to Keith. This one. About network analysis data is only we can use quantitative data for network analysis. That is the first question about network analysis, and also several questions we can cover together. It might be great. The next question is here. Asked to 이재준, probably meant 이재진, I guess. Using network analysis, we can ensure and understand, identify the relationship and workflow within the company. And it might be useful, but sometimes it causes some drawback and some negative effect that we couldn't expect. How can you deal with this? And there's another question about network analysis, which is here to Keith McNulty. How could you collect data for network analysis? And also for general organizations, how can you implement network analysis? Right. Just briefly about the first question, we can use either data like quantitative and qualitative using, as Keith shows you, topic modeling, you can use qualitative data as well to use frequency of each context or words. And some other questions I think Keith can cover to these following questions.
Yeah, so I think the first question was about drawbacks of using network analysis. What I would say first of all is that question was phrased in a very nice way. I do a lot of talks together with a very well-known person who is an expert on organizational design, Dr. Naomi Stanford, and she describes organizational design as understanding the flow of work in an organization. And I think network analysis is an incredibly underused tool for that, because the flow of work does not occur in hierarchical structures. Hierarchical structures are usually in place to just administer an organization, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the flow of work. And I think the example that I showed gives you a good sense of what I mean by that. The only drawback that I think happens with network analysis is not all networks turn out to be very easy to analyze. And so you can create expectations that a network analysis will solve your problem, but often what comes out of the network doesn't show very clear groups or shows a kind of a cloudy, unclear structure, and it's very difficult to take any action on it. And that will happen from time to time. That's part of using advanced mathematical techniques. They sometimes don't give you a clear answer, but that's the main, some drawback. To address the question on data for network analysis, I would split this in two. So first of all, there are ways that you can data for networks is shaped in a fundamentally different way to what we're familiar with. So most of us understand data as being in these rectangular tables that have rows and columns. Network analysis doesn't have that shape, right? It has nodes and it has connections between nodes. And that is better for solving certain types of problems. Now, there's two types of ways you can collect that data. One is actually to collect it directly like that. So we do a regular annual survey at my company where we ask people to nominate people who are their mentors or their sponsors in the company. And that data comes back in a network form. You're able to connect an individual with other individuals who they've nominated as their mentors or sponsors, or vice versa. So you can immediately translate that into a graph. But also, you can use your existing rectangular structure to convert it into network data. So for example, if Jae-jin and I are salespeople, and Jae-jin sells to certain companies, sells products to certain companies, and I sell products to certain companies, the data will only show in the current tables what the companies Jae-jin is selling to and the companies that I'm selling to. But somebody may ask a question, what are the companies that both Keith and Jae-jin sell to? What companies do we have in common? And to do that, you can restructure the data. You can join it up and you can spit it out in a different way to be able to map that. And that's one of the things I try to show people how to do in the book that I've published around network analysis, because it is a big reason why companies have not adopted it yet, because they don't know how to make those data translations.
Yeah, and also I'd like to add one more point on Keith's points. Actually, in terms of the network analysis data, the analyzed result is also the data or information to make a better decision. It's not the right or only answer. So you can supplement the right analyzed result of network analysis to, compare or sometimes supplement other analysis and make a better decision making. The next question is Martin Edwards. From the data, how can we understand or identify whether which indicator is biased or should be eliminated or should be accepted as significant indicators? For example, in labor market, most males perform better than women. How can we deal with this situation or mitigate this bias?
Yeah, there's a whole science associated with that kind of analysis that I'm sure the other people on the panel could talk about. But ultimately, at the end result of an analytic process, the analytic model, if you like, will be giving a certain output recommendation. And so the analysts need to be able to, they need the capability to be able to look at that output and make some assessment about whether or not there's an adverse impact in particular groups within the organization. And it may be, for example, that consistently an analytic model might be making records, so as an example, who to hire, who would be a good person to hire. An analytic model might be looking through a data set of possible applicants and be consistently recommending males for particular technical jobs, for example. And so an analyst needs to be able to look at that data and have the capability to look at that data about whether or not the output is making an adverse recommendation or a recommendation that is consistently problematic in terms of its over-representing males in a particular set of recommendations. So that's the kind of activity that an HR analytics team needs to be able to do, to go and look into an analytic model to make sure that the recommendations aren't adversely advantaging a particular group within the particular data set that it's looking at. And that may involve, well, looking at whether or not it over-represents or there's an over-representation of particular groups that are coming out of the recommendations compared to, say, the nature of the organization in terms of its particular demographic groups. So that's the key thing, that adverse impact analysis is a science in itself.
Great. The next question might be interesting to all of us, maybe to Keith and Eric. This is a question to Keith, actually, but I think Eric also covered some parts of this question. It's in English, so you can read. We are hearing a lot today about how AI will change the develop talent and the need of upskilling employees. Can you talk a bit about the role of people analytics in these coming changes? How do you envisage about this phenomenon?
You want to give it the first shot?
So I think it relates to a little bit of what I was speaking about earlier, which is the reason why the people analytics function needs to, get up those steps of the staircase that I mentioned, is to be able to help their organizations make decisions more rapidly. So one of the things that I'm seeing, and I think we probably are all feeling in the world around us, is that things are moving much more quickly than they used to. Events are happening at an incredible pace. this question is an example of where technology seems to be suddenly disrupting what we believed were stable skills in populations for a long time. Now we're asking, will those skills be needed in the future? Are there skills that we need more of? And we need analytics to be able to drive clarity on that, but we also need analytics that can be delivered quickly, to a certain extent to be automated as much as possible, so that leaders can see this regularly. Another area where more rapid developments are needed is in employee listening, for example. So we've instituted at McKinsey & Company a weekly pulse survey in our employees, because we feel that an annual survey is just not good anymore, because things are moving too quickly. So much can happen in a year at the moment, so we need to be listening to our employees more regularly in this area. So I think, what I like about this question is it allows me to speak about this idea of pace, and how we need to use analytics to kind of increase the pace of the intelligence and information that we're giving to organizations and to organizational leaders, I think.
The next question is to Martin. Actually, this is not the question from the audience. This question is from me. Actually, from your presentation, I came up with this question. And I think this might be beneficial to the audience as well. To mitigate the risks of data misuse or breaches, one suggested approach is data minimization, which mandate collecting and analyzing only the employees' data crucial to the company and transparently communicating this process to employees. While this may be ethically sound, it might constrain people analysts who needs a broader data set for exploratory analysis. If we solicit employees' consent and only use data they permit, our analysis could be confined to a narrow data set. What's your take on this dilemma? Do you see data ethics and data utilization as fundamentally at odds in people analytics? Or is there a way to strike a harmonious balance between the two?
Jing, there's probably about 5 or 6 questions in that question. Not quite sure which one to address. I mean, so one of the issues there around minimizing the data because of to minimize the problems associated with analyzing different types of data. There's a data governance issue there in terms of there's a risk. If you collect lots of data, then that might mean that increases the risk of the organization potentially exposing itself in terms of if there's something goes wrong with that data, or if there's a data breach. So that's a problem there that's a real challenge, but that's a kind of separate issue. Well, that's one type of issue associated with the ethics. So the issue of what kind of data sets an HR analytic team might and should be able to collect for different exploratory HR analytics projects is a really interesting one, because ultimately to get the most benefit from an HR analytics team to get the most benefit from an HR analytics project, really, you'd want that data set to be as broad as possible, integrating lots of different types of data. And so that would be the ideal from a data analytic perspective. But then there's a question associated with, well, should you do that from an HR analytics perspective? So there's an ethics perspective there in terms of just because you can and might want to do lots of analysis and collect as much possible data as you can, should you be doing that? So just because you can doesn't mean you should. And that obviously the ethical perspective there is really important. But I don't see that ethics is at odds with people analytics at all. It is basically something that an HR analytics team needs to be able to reflect on and think about, because every decision-making process that is involved in an organization potentially has some ethical ramifications. So an ethical issue is out there anyway in terms of what an organization does in terms of its activities. It's not at odds with people analytics. It may raise challenges with an analytics team where the organization, the analytics team might think about, okay, should I be doing this kind of analysis? Should I be collecting this kind of data? Yeah, there might be some challenges there, but it's something that the organization should be doing when it carries out an HR analytics project. This issue of ethics is becoming more and more dominant in terms of the narrative in the people analytics sphere. There was a time 10 years ago when, in the early days of people analytics in the public forum, where lots of analytics teams weren't really even thinking about ethics associated with analytics. But as AI, for example, and automated processes are coming into the area of HR analytics and the capabilities of HR analytics teams and the scope of possible analytic projects that analytics teams might get engaged in becomes bigger and bigger, the ethical challenge of these analytic projects becomes more and more to the fore. And it's just something which not at odds with the people analytics activity. It's just something the analytics team needs to be thinking about when they go about their everyday people analytics projects in their team.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Just considering the remaining time, this might be the last question of this session. I recommend one of you voluntarily to answer this question. How best to convince management and leaders of the need for people analytics or AI in HR, especially in the public sector, where maximizing profit is not a priority? Because one of the hosts of this conference is Ministry of Education, so it might be related to public sector. Any of you wants to answer to this question within 1 minute?
I mean, I can try. All of us go through the journey of having to convince our leaders that what we do is important. And I think in the early days of building the function that I've built, one of the most important things was to move up that staircase really quickly in one specific area so that we could demonstrate to our leaders the results of analytics that was valuable to them. And that's the key thing to a leader. If you can give them information that they can act on, that gives them clarity on something where there was not clarity before, that's the first step of showing value to your leaders. It doesn't have to be economic value. It can be related to an entirely different topic, but it's something that's on their minds and something that they're worried about, and you can give them clarity related to that. So if you personally are in a situation where you feel, how do I get this topic or up to the agenda of our leaders, you're not going to do it by convincing them in general. You have to show them something. So you have to look for that opportunity where you have the data, you can do something quickly with it that gives them insight to start believing that there is something here to invest in, I think.
Perfect time, within 1 minute. We end our session now, but this is not the end of the discussion about this topic. The attention to HR or people analytics has been increasing continuously. And there are also simultaneously several sensitive and ethical issues, as we discussed. But this means there is still potential, plenty of room and great potential for you and us to contribute to this field. I really look forward to seeing the further development of HR analytics and vibrant discussions in Korea on this topic in the near future. I want to thank once again today's fantastic panelists, especially to Martin from Australia. And also thank you so much for the audience for joining and listening to us. Thank you.
네. 그동안 조금은 막연하게 느껴졌을 수도 있는 이 HR 애널리틱스의 구체적인 활용법을 알아보고 이를 통해서 조직 역량을 강화할 수 있는 여러 가지 방안을 모색해 보았습니다. 글로벌 인재포럼 2기에 들을 수 있는 또 귀한 정보였던 것 같습니다. 좌장으로 수고해 주신 이재진 교수님과 함께 해주신 연사 여러분께 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 그럼 저희는 여기에서 두 번째 특별 세션을 마무리하겠습니다.